distinguishing. That's what we're looking at. Distinguishing. Alright. Our usual approach will be to ask you to, now it's an English word, you need to ask yourself what's the meaning of distinguishing in English. And if you look at that, to distinguish actually is to know the difference between one thing and the other. So if you now bring it to the law, we're talking about distinguishing. It's still part of precedent. So normally in a case, let me explain first. In a case, the council would cite some authorities and tell the court that these are authorities that are binding on the particular, to help in deciding this particular case. Now, distinguishing actually is a process where you are able to spot, or you're able to find an essential material difference. Essential material difference between the early case that is cited, between the earlier case that is cited as a precedent, and the particular case that you're actually handling before the court. Now, this note again is like there are two cases before. There is a case before the court, a live case before the court, and some authorities are cited as authorities that should be relied upon by the court, and either the counsel or the judge is able to discover an essential difference between that case that was cited as a precedent and the particular case. So like I said, the judge can use this, it's a useful device for a judge, and it's also a useful device for a counsel, because normally, for example, if a case is cited before the judge, and then the judge, it's a binding precedent, but the judge is below that other court, then the judge is bound for the decision. But in a situation where the judge can be able to say that this decision is not the same as what I'm handling before me, because there's an essential difference, material difference between the facts or between the policy, then the judge is now permitted to depart from that decision. So that's one of the devices that a judge can use to actually get away from using a decision that he's not comfortable with, if he can actually distinguish that particular case that is cited for him. And for a counsel in court, when the counsel on that side cites a decision that is against you, it's important that if you can actually be able to spot a difference between that case that was cited, the material facts, for example, that between the case that was cited and the case that you're actually handling, that will be a distinguished, you'll be able to distinguish the case. And if the judge agrees with you that there's a difference between the two decisions, you'll be able to get away free and all of that. In Unity Bank and Abiola, let's use in Unity Bank and Abiola, the counsel laid an argument before the court that the court had overruled one of his decisions in the state had overruled one of the decisions in coal in I can't remember the other party, but this was the argument of the council that this decision had overruled this, and so that the court cannot apply the decision here anymore, but the decision here. Now, but the judge was able to cut a clear distinction between, he was able to distinguish Nweke and the state from the case that he was dealing with. That's in Unity Bank and Abiola. He distinguished Nweke from here, and he said, for example, that in Nweke's case, that it was an interlocutory application which did not determine the outcome of the case. While this one was the interlocutory application, then also in Nweke and the state, there was no application for striking out. There was no application for striking out before the court. And so based on that, and while in Unity Bank and Abiola there was an application before the court for striking out, it was something that had to do with the council, JHC Okolo, senior advocates in Enugu State here. There was a mistake in the typing of their name and the case was struck out. But that was in Nweke and the state. But in this particular instance, the court was not willing to strike out the decision, but it was able to distinguish this case from this case, Nweke's case from Unity Bank and Abiola, and held that this case was not even overruled by the court in that particular instance. So that's an essential part of distinguishing. That's what happens in distinguishing. That's how the judge can escape a precedent he doesn't like, and how a counsel can still be able to turn a case in his own favor. And then Granville Williams, in learning the law, talked about two types of distinguishing. He talks about the restrictive and the non-restrictive. Now he says in the restrictive distinguishing, the later court actually cuts down on the ratio that was made in the first case, or introduces an exception to the ratio. It's okay, yeah, that ratio, well, it has an exception, so it cuts it down, narrows down the ratio in the first decision. So you should say, well, if you look at it that way, you realize that it must be the prerogative of the judge to say that kind of thing. You could suggest the judge, but in non-restrictive distinguishing, in that particular instance, that's the one we all know and practice, that you're able to look at an essential, the court accepts the earlier ratio, but just decides that it doesn't apply in this particular case because there is a material difference that is between this case, like we already showed in this particular two cases. I'll just illustrate this with one English case. We have the case of Balfour and Balfour. I think that was in 1919. And the case of Merritt, which should be 1970. You will find this case in your second year in when you're talking about in the contract law of contract, when you're discussing the intention, one of the essentials of a valid contract, the fourth essential, which is the intention to create legal relations. Now the law there is that domestic arrangements, promises made within the domestic arrangements, normally are not binding. They cannot be construed as a valid contract. So in Balfour and Balfour, a husband promised the wife that he will paying her £30 until she recovers from her illness and comes to visit him in the Republic of Ceylon where he was working. And so when he failed to pay the £30, the court, the wife sued, and the court held that it was a domestic arrangement, and so it was not binding on the husband. Now, in Merritt and Merritt in 1970, it involved a case where a husband and the wife were already separated. And then after they separated, they met, and the husband promised to be paying the wife £40 so that she can pay off the mortgage on their house. And then that after she has paid off the mortgage, he will transfer the house to her. So by the time she had finished paying off the mortgage, the husband refused to transfer the house to her. And then when the case came before the court and Balfour was cited, Lord Denning distinguished these two cases by saying that in this particular case, the husband and the wife were living together. But in this particular instance, the husband and the wife were no longer living together. And so the principle that was applicable here could also not apply in that particular decision. So that's basically the principle of distinguishing, and you should be able to, you have to look at the facts basically. It's a matter of being able to look at the facts clearly and be able to discover where the facts differ, so that you can actually be able to say that what decision was made in this particular case is not applicable in this particular case. One particular author has also suggested that you can not only distinguish based on the facts, but you can also distinguish based on the policy. So he said, for example, that if you look at a judgment, you can say, well, in this particular judgment, the policy that led to this particular decision was this, but now you see the policy has changed, and so this particular decision should not also apply in this particular instance. So it's not just distinguishing based only on the facts, but also you can also distinguish based on the policy. It's a very important skill to learn as a lawyer, and then also be able to practice, and it's practice that will actually make you perfect. So the next discussion we'll have now is to look at the concepts of reversing, overruling, and setting aside, which are somehow related concepts, but which we still need to be able to understand the way they work so that we can actually use them properly.